Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to our talk today on art, death and legacy, which is a rather dramatic title of what we're going to talk about, which is basically the administration of artists' estates and legacy planning for artists. My name is Jessica Carlisle. I work for Artistate. Artistate is a brand new enterprise. It was founded last year by 4 professionals, one of whom, Catherine Hill, sitting on my left, who had all, during their work, come across scenarios, very unfortunate scenarios, where artists hadn't made sufficient plans for what happened when they died to their work, and a sort of avoidable, difficult situations. And they it started a conversation, and they realised that there was really no one place for artists to go to, or indeed artists' estates to go to get a sort of 360 integrated service with people who had expertise in their field, but also specialist knowledge of the art world. So I'm not going to say any more about Artistate today, but if you do want more information, there's some printouts and some QR codes on the side. Introducing my panellists. So first of all, we have Catherine Hill, who I mentioned is an Artistate founder. Her day job is a partner at Forsters, which is one of London's leading law firms. They are also a sponsor of London Art Fair. Catherine has decades of experience advising clients and their families about estate planning matters, and lots of complicated trust stuff that luckily is beyond the remit of what we're going to be talking about today. But recently has carved out a niche and expertise in advising artists, specifically, some very high-profile ones, and she heads their art and cultural property department. So thank you, Catherine, for joining us. Our second guest is Matthew Travers. Matthew is a specialist in modern British art. He and his father run Nobile Gallery, which I'm sure you all know. It's been going since 1985, and they are the first stand as you come into the fair. So do go and take a look. Matthew studied at the Courtauld, and over the last few years has created a number of exhibitions which have re-established the reputation of certain artists, most recently Walter Sickert. Prior to that, Leon Kossoff, Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell. I'm sure many of you saw the exhibitions. So thank you. Last but definitely not least, we're really delighted to have Sam Mundy on our panel. Sam is an artist based in Devon or Cornwall.
Right on the border.
Right on the border, somewhere between. And Sam is also not only an artist, but he's also the son of 2 artists. His mother was the acclaimed British abstract painter Gillian Ayres. I'm sure all of you will know her work. R.A. CBE, and who sadly died in 2018. And Sam's father was another abstract painter, Henry Mundy, whose work you'll find in the Tate collection, the British Council collection, the Government Art collection, and many others beside. And Sam runs both his parents' estates, as well as his own practice. So thank you so much for joining us. It's really nice to have 3 panellists, all from very different fields. So I guess, actually, before I start asking them questions, I just wanted to, actually, a show of hands, if we had any answers, how many artists we have in the audience. Okay, right. And how many work professionally with artists or artists' estates? Okay. I don't know who the rest of you are then. Okay. Anyway, we'll soon hopefully find out. Okay, so I guess the first part of the talk is I really just wanted to get our guests to talk a bit about their own experience of working with artists' estates, really, and living art stuff, but particularly with an emphasis on artists' estates, and how working with the estates or representing them or managing them, what their experience has been. And I'm actually going to start with Matthew, because So, Piano Nobile works with a number of very significant British artists, so you have quite, presumably, years of experience of working with the States, and I think your gallery represents a couple.
Very much so.
Yeah. So, open question to you.
I'd always view it as a partnership, really. I think it's different to working with a living artist. I think the priorities change slightly. Ultimately, you're dealing with a finite body of work, and it really depends on the priority of the artist who's sadly no longer there, and their family, and you can come to that situation with a number of different priorities, and some of the estates we work with, those priorities fluctuate very dramatically. So, on level like someone like William Crozier, the estate of William Crozier, who work closely with his Catherine. Take one example, which is about managing the body of work, promoting Bill as a painter, and also promoting any artist costs money, and not just in terms of putting on exhibitions at the gallery, and also helping support museum exhibitions, from the most mundane things like transport and insurance all the way through to framing and publications, and even potentially catalogue resume. I just think that's a wonderful achievement for any estate to have published in a major way, and a definite way.
Did you work with him in his lifetime? Or
we did. We knew Bill well, and we had worked with him, but not really in a formal way. It was very much after his death that we got involved with the work. To take one example, and I suppose another similar example was someone like John Golding, again, who we knew in his lifetime, and had been to see a lot, were friends with. It was really only after his death that we became involved with the work. That's slightly different in the fact that one of John's requests is that the work, a part of his body, or a major body of his work, went into a museum or a teaching collection. So, although there's been exhibitions and we've been displaying his work and promoting it and celebrating it, one of the aims there was always that a substantial proportion of the estate, what's left of the estate, was to be given away, and that's another way of handling that body of work. And I think it's I'm sure this is something we want to talk about much more, but it's an amazing thing to be left with their parents' legacy, in this case artistic one, but also a huge burden and a real pressure for the inheritors. I think that's something we get involved with and advise with and help to come up with a plan to I think as long as there's a plan in place, people can act on that. Of course, one of the huge things that involves initially is just getting things catalogued, making sure things are safe. Artist studios aren't always the most appropriate environments for works to be stored long term. Perhaps adapting the space, or maybe after an artist's death, their house and their studio is no longer, it has to be sold. So then it's a case of things going into storage, which can be costly and indefinite, really, in terms of it might be a body of work that is very much saleable. As most artists do, there's also a huge number of things that are almost just documental and archival, and then it's sorting all that as well. So I think it's if you try to take it as a whole, it's a huge task, probably rather overwhelming. I think it's definitely about bite sizes and moving forward in achievable ways.
I think you've touched on so many things there that I think we should discuss it. And I'm also particularly interested in what you say about how the dynamics change when from working with the living artist to then working with the estate. It's very different. You sum it up also. It's a finite pool, and also perhaps your focus does change as a dealer. When in lifetime it's about profile raising, but it's about sales, and then after you are thinking about legacy, but maybe it's not as high up the agenda, and then suddenly you've got a finite pool, you've got perhaps a time element, how to place it, and also you're not working with the artist. You're
No,
working.
that's forever the missing presence, and I think you do feel that. You sometimes think, oh, is this the decision they would have wanted?
Yes.
But ultimately, one tries to make solid and sound decisions that are important in terms of an artist's legacy, artistically, but also are practical in terms of the finance arrangements of an estate. Another aspect that we work with certainly and think about and what we're involved with is, depending on the type of estate too, it might be sometimes advisable to try and buy works back into the estate's ownership. Often with estates there are holes, or you're left with a lot of late work, early work, or the work that people haven't looked at that regularly. And that's partly because any artist is usually interested in their most contemporary work, and that's the thing they want to show. So things do get put to one side. It can also be very exciting, because then there are amazing resources of work that haven't been seen sometimes for decades.
I think you strike on something which I find quite interesting, is where the line is drawn between what the gallery does and what the estate does, because there's a lot of grey area between, like you say, cataloguing, photographic works, restoration works, publication, which, depending on the sort of profile of the artist and the capacity of the gallery, can fall sort of anywhere. Does it vary from artist to artist, to estate?
I think it's a case-by-case basis. And as I say, working with an estate like working with an artist, we always use a partnership. And it's not something you take on particularly lightly, and it's not something that should be a short-term arrangement. I think it's something you have to be thinking 5 to 10 years, if not longer. Because nothing happens, tends to happen quickly in the art world. And actually, things need to be built up in a sustainable way, and that can't necessarily be done overnight. But yes, to answer that, there might be some estates that come, nothing's ever been catalogued, the artist actually has very low profile, but the work is obviously beautiful, high quality, and that can be very exciting, because suddenly you might have an almost entirely complete body of work. Some artists who painted their entire lives or produced their entire lives, and really very little is gone out of the world. Artists to say like Cyril Mann, who we work with, or Leo Davey, really very little of their work was sold in their lifetimes, and actually that's an amazing thing, to then to start from scratch and to get this work out into the world. Rarely in this business do you kind of have the ability to see a whole artist's work in one place. It's also incredibly daunting for the family or the gallery, because you have to start from scratch.
We were having a conversation recently about artists who had slightly disorderly studios and estates with disorderly studios, and whether, as a gallerist coming along and seeing an amazing body of work but a complete mess, is enough to put a gallery off if they think, oh, this is, and I'm sure it's a subject we'll return to, but I guess my point to you is, from an estate's, if I said to you as a dealer, what do you consider to be a well-run estate, and what do you think facilitates you to do your job best? Is it a well-documented, well-catalogued?
That certainly helps. I think the first thing we do, if it hasn't been done, is to say, let's try and find a system to get something catalogued. Let's try and get everything photographed. Let's nowadays get it onto some form of database. We use ArtLogic a lot because it's very useful to use and easy to use. But yes, of course, some estates, artists we work with, are hugely successful in their lifetimes. Funds are relatively available. They may just be the type of artist who's incredibly organised, and everything is immaculately kept, accurate records. It does happen, and we work with several like that, and that's obviously makes everyone's life easier. But I don't think you could walk into a situation and say, oh, because this is seemingly chaos, we're going to pass on it. I think that would be, first and foremost, the work comes first, and those sort of things can be fairly simply and easily rectified. But then, of course, some estates have their own management system. They might have several members of staff that work for them. William Scott estate or Carlisle estate now. They're very well run internally. And then that's just an altogether different type of relationship where they are their own entity.
Yes.
And they make internal decisions, which is excellent.
Yeah.
So I think it's a case-by-case basis on how one works with the
And
individual.
I think it's interesting what you say, some artists they say are self-sufficient as an entity and they sort of choose different galleries to partner with, and then others might not be so sort of and outsource that to the gallery. So there's so many different dynamics the way it can work. Catherine, I'm going to just put you in the hot seat next. Now, Catherine's obviously a lawyer, so she's got very strict client confidentiality rules.
Sadly.
So you can't talk to. Well, first of all, how is working with an artist different from working with another ordinary individual?
I think that when you're a private client lawyer, there's a sort of family doctor element to it. So whatever work we do, we have to understand what the dynamic in a family is, or indeed around a particular person. So for artists, they have an extra person in their life, which is their artwork, inseparable from them. And so for me, it is a very different experience because what I like to do is to see them in situ, to see the studios, to visit them at home, and get a better sense of how they work, what their work means to them,
Interesting.
and who they work with, because all of that is quite critical to then how you would document their wishes longer term and guide them through the process of selecting people to fulfill quite formal roles like executor or trustee. And of the terrible stories we hear, often it's because the choices were made possibly without reflection, or indeed without any advice at all. So it's very important that I see them.
I love that. So one of the first things you do is actually go and visit the
I
studio.
try.
But
Not all
why not?
artists
So
are
we
keen
all-
on that. How strange are coming to your studio is not always what everybody wants, but it does help. So over
Yes.
time, even if I get to know people, I'll go and see the studio eventually. But that's an important thing.
And do you mostly work with living artists, or you work with advising estates as well, or do you?
It's mostly living artists at present, although I would say that the reason Artistate came about was specifically in relation to a particular estate, where I was working with Pierre, who's not here, who's Constantine Cannon, very well known.
He's another
lawyer.
artistate founder.
And he had been asked questions and didn't have all the answers, and so rang me, and he rang other contacts of his to help. And this was an artist who was a contemporary of Victor Passmore, who died with a will in the mid-90s, and had said, I leave all my artwork to my executor to be distributed according to my wishes, which I communicated to her. She died and hadn't communicated any wishes at all, and the executor was a friend, and so where do you start? And this came down to us something like 25 years after that event, and the executor now almost mentally incapacitated, and it was a question of trying to piece together what did the will really intend, and who owned these paintings even, because a gift like that is not a gift to an executor, it's a gift to who, we don't know, but there's no formal trust. The residual beneficiaries of the donkey sanctuary and something else, so as you can imagine it was quite a muddle. And this is an artist who has no real commercial profile, but is very interesting, and so we were keen to help. So a lot of the problems out there are with artists who are not recognised yet, would love to be, and there's not always a lot of money floating around, and so that's why Artistate began at a sort of lower level, just to be able to help in a cost-efficient way.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because legacy planning, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Like you said, there's sort of artists with very established markets. There are artists who might not have any market at all, but it might change. Like you said yourself, Matthew, you might have an estate where the artists have nothing in their lifetime, but then the market grows, and we all know about that these days with the art market. There are many artists who have posthumous fame. But it's knowing what structure to put in place that can provide for any situation, right?
The common thread, I guess, with whether there is notoriety or not, or rather commercial presence or not, is that every artist has a business. And I think that many many artists, and I think it's few, I would say, who consider it to be a commercial business and run it like that with great efficiency during their life. So often there's a bit of detective work to be done. Even very well-known artists that I've acted for a few, when you look at the nuts and bolts of, well, what is the business? Because they start as a sole trader, they then probably incorporate, or there's a partnership along the way. Is there absolute clarity as to which of those businesses owns the works? Where does the studio sit in all of this? And the reason it's key for everybody is that a business is exempt from inheritance tax. And so if you can structure it correctly and have your assets in the right place, it then means that the drafters of wills like me can create trusts which are lovely and flexible, and not be too concerned about being overly prescriptive when we write the will, which can be very dangerous. There have been numerous stories in years gone by of people requesting things that then don't happen. And one I remember from having read about it is Clifford Still, who's one of the colour field artists who died, I think, in the late 70s or 80s, and left a legacy saying, I want to leave all my artwork to whichever city in the States will build a museum and house it permanently and not sell any. And unsurprisingly, it took 24 years to get that museum set up in Denver, which is now there.
Amazing.
Yeah, but it's probably not the way to do it.
No, not the way to do it. 24 years. Thank you, Catherine. Sam, you're next. I always don't know what to ask you. You're a man on the ground. You have a very interesting story. Your parents, as I mentioned, both artists, first together, then separated, then back together again. Very close family. Could you tell us a bit about your story? Your parents were both kind of quite elderly when they died. Did they have plans in place?
Well, I think most artists don't think they're going to die. You know, fairness. I don't think, you know, they know it's going to happen, but they don't think it is. And my parents certainly, even when they got old and quite geriatric, they did not think they were going to die. It was not. Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of death is an outrage. Yes, this is what they thought. I ended up having some knowledge because the last 3 years of my mother's life, the last 2 two of those years she was taught painting. She didn't paint the last year. But the things started kind of piling up, like more interest and more things to organise. Then I started stepping in and doing it. Partly also she couldn't use a computer and I did, so I did all those things are more and more email based.
Yes.
Then I was dealing with it. And I'm very glad that I did have that time because I wouldn't have known what the hell was happening afterwards.
Yes.
It's very, very difficult.
So it happened by necessity rather than her planning for it?
Yes, it happened by necessity, then it happened by chance. She gave me a copyright before she died, simply because she didn't want to be disturbed with me saying, so-and-so wants to do this.
She gave you all her copyright?
Basically, yes. So that's what happened.
Gosh.
I then got the permission to then grant it. And that happened, yes, before she died, and so one carries on doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you get 9 in a week, other times you get none.
Yes.
It's a real. Sometimes you have to spend days phoning people up, checking what they want to do. Sometimes you upset people because you don't like what they're going to write under this, and then you say no, and then get ready, or they're all writing rubbish or something, so you just don't want to.
Can you refuse because you don't like?
Well, I just say they can't have it.
Okay, Catherine, I'm sure might have words, but
Well, no, not. You've written to a couple of dealers saying, is there anyone else they can?
Yes.
No,
they can't.
Or they can get it from 1 or 2 places, but we're not going to say so. No, they really were writing rubbish, so I had to. I mean, it was absolutely like nothing to do with this painting. And, I mean, it was a total crap. So there's about 3 now that I've had like that are very annoyed.
But it is all a part of the state administration.
Well, I ended up sort of having to hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Because even on her deathbed, she said, you're meant to be in Hong Kong at the moment. She was supposed to be having a show in Beijing that following September. She wanted me to go to Hong Kong to meet the Chinese dealer and organise it. And I said, well, I'm not going now, am I? And she said, well, I want you going next week, even if I linger. And I said, well, I'm not going. and put on. But I ended up in Beijing, an art fair. There were her paintings. They had gone and put a 10-foot by 10-foot square photograph in one end of it. That was quite hard, like literally about 7 days after
Yes,
behind.
yes. So you really did go straight
I
out
did
after
hit the
she
ground
left.
running with all that, and then also organised, and the show happened in September, and it just, it's sort of gone on from there.
Yeah.
She'd already, before she died, she removed her paintings from one gallery. So afterwards, with my brother, because I don't do anything without his permission. I mean, that is very important in families, is that you do have to work with your siblings. We walked all over London looking at galleries, and then they both like the Marlborough, partly because they didn't show silly gold blingy art in art fairs, because that could get really horrible. And then she had a show last September.
Yes.
That sort of, yes, so, and there are things that were sort of in the pipeline.
So there was a complicated situation with her gallery relationships at the time of her death, and you actually moved the estate.
Well, I didn't move it. They've still got the prints. She moved the paintings, and I'm responsible for the storage bills, and I do it, and
yeah,
and it's quite a responsibility then. I mean, you have to. I've split them up now because I don't want them all in one. I mean, that's very important. Don't have all your work in one place.
Yes.
I mean, the Momark fire of years ago, absolutely.
Just wiped out.
Yes.
Sort of practice.
Well, it wiped out with two artists that are no longer with us, and they were dead at the time. It wiped out a vast percentage of their work, and it could be wiped out a whole lot of somebody's work if they didn't sell much in their lifetime.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, artists only exist if their work's out there. Like, there's no point in all in a cupboard and that's it. Because nobody sees it, then things can happen to it, and that's.
Yeah. I think, well, thank you for speaking. I think one of the things that always strikes me when Joyce said that, how you hit the ground running, to use your term, that a lot of people inherit a parent's estate sort of and blindsided, really. They don't know where to start. They don't work in the field. They don't have any understanding of the art, although they may not even know their parents' practice that well. I seem to remember you saying that you used to do crits of each other's work at home, like as part of a family sort of conversation.
Yeah, heavy-duty breakfasts, heavy-duty discussions.
Yeah.
No, it could happen. Now, a lot of artists' families, they don't know what the artist does. That can even happen with husbands and wives not knowing, let alone their kids. Like, they can lead quite separate lives.
Yeah.
This person that goes out to private views only mixes in a certain way. And they can be very separate.
Yes.
And for those people that are left, it's a complete minefield for them.
Yeah.
Because they don't know, and they don't understand. And it is, even if somebody's writing rubbish about that work or not, or it's that sort of thing.
But I wanted to draw Catherine in here because I think when we talk about legacy planning, things on write a will, but it's much more than that. And I guess what I'm getting to here is the idea of drawing the family in, or it may not be family, it may be whoever you trusted friends or advisors, but just sort of educating your beneficiaries prior to death. It's something one should start thinking about, presumably.
Yes, definitely. It's a team effort, and most commonly, in fact, that the artists referred to me will have some connection with often a child who's been referred through sometimes the RA or somewhere else. They reach me and find me somehow. And it's often at the point where the parent has separately run their art world, possibly with their sort of marriage to a dealer or their close relationship with an accountant or someone who's been a significant influence in their life. The children or the spouse, as you say, not involved at all. But age does change that. And in fact, one of the key clients I have was definitely in that situation because they came to me looking just for some specific advice on how business, which means that you can lose the relief entirely. So that's quite dangerous, and you have to think about how you handle it. And I think it was a turning point for them as a group because she could see that the children were able to take things and run with them, as you say, and perfectly capable of becoming involved without it stepping on her artistic territory. And so from that point onwards, there's been a big sea change, and she now just works every day, doing the thing that she loves doing most, and the children are busy restructuring everything. And it's important that they're all engaged, because the will in that case was very simple. A lot of artists have a will, majority probably don't, but it usually says everything to my spouse, absolutely, failing which, everything to my children, absolutely, in equal shares. In this case, children in their 50s, children below that, grandchildren, who are minors. So you would have ended up, if one of them had died, with these works being owned by 2 adults and some small children over here, all entitled equally in a single painting.
Yeah.
So obviously we dealt with the will there, and then we looked at setting up foundations and the wider picture. But it has to be a group effort at best, definitely.
And do you think people generally start thinking about it at the right time? I mean, you get someone say, they say never want to think about it, and then but there's a sort of age that one reaches, or something happens where they start considering it.
I think that's right, and it's the same whether you're an artist or anybody else. There's a natural point where you begin to feel frail, and you may not slow down. I sort of feel I'm slowing down at 54, but it does happen, and that's when people turn to thinking they've got to do something. And in fact, a couple we saw the other day, where the wife was saying, you really need to do something about this.
Yeah.
And in a way, what she wanted was that meeting, just to have a platform to vent a little bit. I think that does happen in sort of 60s and 70s typically.
And Matthew, do you, with any of the living artists, for want of a better word, you work, do you talk about stuff like this with them? There are some galleries who actively encourage their artists to go and seek advice and get their ducks in a row. And other galleries are a bit hesitant to do it because they're fear of the conflict. So
it's a good question. Sadly, less and less do we work with living artists. For our period, so many of them are now in their late 80s or 90s.
Yes.
But no, yes, absolutely. And obviously there are examples where we do, or there's examples where people just come to us for general advice.
Yes.
That's not necessarily in a
You
formal
can
way.
point them to Artistate now.
And I would always say to someone, to try and be prepared. And it's hard though, because a body of work can have a huge value or no value, and intrinsically some of these objects in themselves aren't worth very much, but obviously artistically can be, and that's a very complicated area too, and value can change over time for a number of reasons. So I would always advise someone to have given it some forethought, and I think perhaps it's on again, it's a case by case scenario depending on the situation, probably, and the relative to everything else going on in one's life, how important that is. But no, good planning, forward planning is never a bad thing.
Never bad. So we talked about sort of the idea of a handover. We've also touched on cataloguing, and you said something interesting, Catherine, which is that artists don't want to be in their studio doing their cataloguing and their archiving, but it is really crucial. So it's really nice that there's that set up. You were talking about where the artists can focus full time on their work and have somebody else doing it for them. But I was speaking to the curator of quite a significant estate about this talk that we were doing, and I said, do you have any tips, or what would you say? And she said 1 word, 2 words, stockbook, which is a very old-fashioned word, but I think we all know what she meant. The idea of cataloguing and having a list at least of what's in the studio and what's not only what's in the studio, what's been sold and what's on consignment. And Sam, what was the status of your parents? So did they?
Well, I find the term stockbook a very difficult term when it comes to art. It's a very weird idea.
It is weird, yes.
Probably one had to have things itemised for valuation afterwards and all that. A lot of the stockbook is up here,
Yes.
I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, often it is.
It is a very weird thing. No, probably not everything is labelled
Yeah.
and itemised. And it's a sort of
Ongoing.
Well, Yes, I mean, you know, things get stuffed in cupboards, things get stuffed in folders, and you find the folder and
There's also
things you haven't seen before.
And also something you mentioned earlier, that some things might qualify as a major work or a sort of a minor work, and then you've got preparatory works, you've got archival works. So there's also, it can be quite, archival.
Unfinished works.
Or unfinished
Yeah,
works.
that's the case.
And actually something I wanted to just talk about was the process of self-editing. And Catherine and I have had conversations with this with different because that's quite a tricky. It's something that we think artists should do, but it's where to draw the line. And I actually wanted Sam to talk about his father's bonfire of vanities, I think you called it.
Well, it's not the bonfire, we don't call it the vanities, it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
One day for years, there was always a stack of paintings on cardboard my father had done in the late 50s, early 60s. They were the pieces that he was best known for. And then there was an enormous stack of them. And when we moved to North Wales, one day I got off the school bus and there was this big pump of snow and I knew what he'd done. And I went ballistic. He said I was clearing space. The house that we were in there at that moment was far bigger than the one in London. They'd grown up storing them in London and it was just heartbreaking. Then later on, everybody wanted that work. Monetarily, he could have had quite a different life on it too.
Yeah. So this is a really...
Deep down, I think he was always pleased because he didn't really want to be known for that work. I found quite a few. I found some that, that escaped that fire. And they are very nice things, but no, what went up that day was over 250 of them, and it was heartbreaking. But on the other hand, it's only an artist that has the right to do that to their work. The families can't do it afterwards. None of us can do it. We can't do it to their work. It's a very weird moment that the self-edit, they can self-edit, and even if they make mistakes, that's their business.
Yeah, that's their prerogative.
I do discuss that with the artists that I represent, and they do vary. Some will buy works back in order to get rid of them because they feel it's the wrong image. But then I was interviewing Jock McFadden, who's a Royal Academician, a couple of months ago, and he said it's interesting that when you're young as an artist, you're exploring new directions all the time. But when you're 70, as he is, in fact he's a bit more now, he said it's almost like turning around and looking at the footprints in the snow and acknowledging the work that you have done over the past 40 or 50 years that's there, and it's evidence of what you were, and it shouldn't be destroyed. That's not to say you can't go on and try new things, but he would certainly say that keep everything because it defines how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, it's all part of the story.
I think my advice would perhaps be similar to yours, somewhat controversial to an extent that if I was talking to an artist at a stage in their life where they were really thinking about this, I think a degree of self-editing, as you say, only the artist can do it, can make only actually on a hobby a good thing.
Yeah.
But of course that's on a case-by-case scenario, it's on the artist.
It's also thinking about the as rather than inherit a whole studio, you're not sure how to, which works to focus on and which it's sort of thinking about the future.
Can I chip in again? Sorry. The other thing that's important as the lawyer is almost the grades of how you categorise it, because for me, ideally I would want to know what an artist considers to be the core works, the endowment pieces that go with it that would represent a good phase for every period in their artistic career. And then I'd want them to look at, obviously, archival material going with, the other works that they would see as things they don't mind being sold, that can go out into the world and provide money, because there's always this tension between legacy, what is it, and how do you keep your work in the public eye, versus providing for those around you. Not all artists have close family members, but a lot of them do. And those stories that we read about, whether you're looking at Rothko or Rauschenberg, that's all tension between family and then the foundation, because they're states, and obviously foundations being very common.
It's very important that thing of what is considered to be core works, because they can be from different periods.
Yes.
People should. Artists should even discuss that with their families or dealers even, like these are the bits we don't want sold, or if they're sold they can only go to museums.
Stick
If they
them on
want to do
back
it,
as they do not.
well, it's a retrospective, they want to know where they are so they can borrow them back, because it can be really difficult later on. You know, things can sell, the secondary market, the tertiary market can go on, and then you lose them, you lose track, you have no idea where they've gone. And so to keep, for families or whoever, to keep this core collection is very, very important, or know where those pieces are, because yes, there are the very best works from an artist's period, or what they think of as the others, and they have to be sort of kept.
Well, Paul Clay had a special class, didn't he? The sort of the pictures that he denoted as being his core works. He was terribly organised.
Yes, what was the name?
I think that might be a translation.
Sorry, thank you.
But no, this is the same with Kitai. At the time of his death, he named a number of works which would go to the children that he considered the very best works he had still in his care, that he owned of his own work. And then a number of works that went into his estate, into his foundation, if you like. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, I think there's this idea, and I think this is what Artistate is very interested in, that, you spoke about people inheriting Artistate, and it's a burden, you've got an emotional touch, you've got to manage somebody's legacy, you've got storage bills, insurance bills, and actually, if the artist starts thinking about these things in advance, you can slim things down, you can plan, and going forward into the future, you can run an estate like if not a business, something that washes its own
Certainly,
face.
it should sustain itself.
Yeah, and we've been speaking about copyright, and of course, going forward, there's obviously got to mention it, NFTs, but the Artistate team is quite excited about it, because now there is the right for artists to build contractual obligations, including resale rights, into future contracts. So suddenly you can start getting income streams for estates, and if you've managed to sort of boil the work down, so you've got your insurance costs down, it's obviously going to be different for different estates, but we think there's huge potential there. It doesn't have to be this onerous burden, which I think a lot of people.
And it's worth mentioning our colleague John Martin and the Fred Yates estate. He died in 2008, Cornish painter, some of you may know. He was resident in France at the time, had 400 paintings there. France, on that death, he was intestate. Sold his local belongings at a flea market and auctioned off all his works for something like a sixth of the price, John said. 200 works are here in the UK. He's intestate, which is please make a will, everybody, because that then is bona vacantia, goes to the Crown. And the government legal department are not interested in a plan that's been put forward by the Art Fund, Cornish Museums and John, that proposes a way of holding these, and as they have calculated, coming back to the royalties point, 10 million royalty potential over a 70-year period. But the government are not in the business of looking after capital.
And he had
So
no
they're selling.
heirs.
No heirs.
At all.
And it's also avoidable.
Yeah. Look at that. Our time is up, and we haven't even talked about wills.
Never mind.
And that's a legacy of that. But there's time. There's time, because we have left room for a bit of questions, a few questions even. Does anybody have anything they want to ask? We have a question there.
Good afternoon. It's a question for Matthew. You mentioned John Golden. John was an established art historian and a teacher. And I just wondered how far you had got with leaving his work with an educational institution.
It's a good question. And actually an amazing example of someone who had two lives, a full academic life, wrote seminal books on abstraction and cubism, curated amazing shows to the end of his life into the 90s, Leisure and Picasso, and then was also, as you say, an amazing painter, painted from early on in his life, quite figurative work, through to his later work, which is very abstract, and in a way follows his book, Paths to Abstraction. And with success, I would say. A number of works have gone to several different institutions across the globe, in the UK, in the US, the Yale Centre for British Art, in the UK, so works on paper and on canvas to a whole variety of different museums. Yale, in the end, is the place where the teaching collection, if you like, ended up, and that was a very appropriate home. John had shown there in his lifetime and had good connections with the institution, and that continues. I'm hoping they'll be shown in South America next year or the year after. We did a show at Sarchley some years ago called Golding Cairo, and both John Golding and Anthony Cairo were good friends. And although their work had never been exhibited together, and it was wonderful to show these three-dimensional, amazing pieces of sculpture with John's abstract paintings. And David Allen found, and certainly worked with the Smithsonian Museum, was very helpful in that, and wrote on it and spoke beautifully about it. And it continues. It's certainly not over yet. The estate has a good number of works, and many plans continue into the future. Gifting things isn't as easy as saying, well, gifting and saying is just as hard in a way, because when you're gifting to institutions, they have to think forever, and therefore there is a financial burden on them that comes with that, or just a general burden, and people are quite cautious about accepting things. So that's another whole area to navigate.
Yeah, I would say the same, the gifting versus selling.
On the whole, my advice to people too is, I've seen examples too of Artistate and some we've worked with, will remain nameless in this case, who after the artist's death, the family gave major works to certain institutions, to others, and actually I feel quite strongly they should have made those institutions pay for them.
Yes.
Because if they had, the works would be, the institution would work harder for it and would probably celebrate it more. Often great things can then slip into, say, the Tate's collection and not be on display and go into their stores, because obviously they have a huge number of works. And it's fantastic it's in that collection, but it's a shame that if it's not seen. And the examples of works, things which have been sold, and a role we play in, a large part in helping fundraise, and that may happen over several years even. But in the end, it's a celebration when the work gets there, and usually, if an institution has a desire for a work, the money can be found, even if it's not at a full commercial price. One reflects that. But I think it is important. Something I would always advise for if possible.
That's an interesting change, I think.
Yes, indeed. I hope that's what answers your question in an extended way.
Question at the front here. Thank you.
I first want to say I find this incredibly useful to hear this talk, because it sort of throws up all kinds of things. I'm an artist, and I've been sort of like working, or I'm starting to work with Artistate via Jesuit Carlisle, who I knew, but also, I'm sort of at the age that I think, well, I'd really better get my act together. Basically also because, I don't want to burden, say, people who know nothing about my world with something, to solve. But I think one thing which I like as something very helpful is, first of all, maybe to sort of like think really, what is your core collection, or which kind of works you think these should be, not be sold straight away, and sort of be kept so that they can be circulating. The other question about the structure of work, I have occasionally, I think, okay, and I'm really, spring cleaning, I don't really do, washing my windows that much, but I do occasionally get a Stanley knife out and cut the back canvases, or I repaint them. And the repainting is a problem, because I cannot remember sometimes where a painting has gone, and then occasionally say, oh no, it's under that one. So I say to people, when it gets sold or something, listen, you get the price of one. So I think it is a very good kind of warning, or sort of maybe to bring to the attention of artists. Because as you say, Sam, most of the kind of stuff is in my head. I mean, I have, I think the artist knows where is what. Mostly, I have some kind of stock book with letters of artists where it is, galleries. But I think it is good, although I'm not the most organized person, that it might actually help an artist to sort of look at their work occasionally and see. Well, I think also weed out the weak parts. Because you just all think, hey, listen, like some photographs, you say, listen, those can't believe it, they're not my good kind of side or something. And I think also with artwork, you say, listen, I've learned from it, but as a final piece, it's not really strong enough. So I think it is actually very helpful, not just to put together, just sort of the will and the letter of wishes and all that, but to talk. Because this kind of talking and thinking, I think, will also help an artist to look more critically at their work after they've done their day of painting or filmmaking or whatever, and just get a bit another perspective. So thank you very much for at least starting this. I mean, I have sort of like quite a few questions in practical ways, but I think it is all sort of like the panel being quite different angles. This is quite helpful to, I think, for an artist to look at their work in a different kind of way, and to see, you can always end up in skip, of course, at some point. I think the only problem is, of course, if it doesn't sell at all by the trustees, say after 5 years, whether the artist has to put in some provision on this, and if the money to support this is now run out, and is after 5 years there's no movement in it. Should it then be
and we do that actually. I have a number of artists where there's sort of sunset, as they call it, in the States, where in fact one of my artists is I think an RA even, so it's being a bit negative. So if nothing happens within 5 years, then it needs to fold into X or Y. So people do think like that.
Because that is quite
My advice to people is that it always takes longer than you think it's going to take. And when I hear 5 years, I think, that's not long enough. That's a blink of an eye, and you can take years to just organise an exhibition because of the logistics of it, and put together a book or a catalogue. Even a catalogue resume, that can be a lifetime's work. So my advice to people, if you're inheriting an artist, say you work with an artist family member or whatever, you have to be patient and take a long time.
Can I just chuck in one more thing? And in response to that is, have a flexible will that has a trust, have the right trustees, because all you can do is map it out for today.
Yeah.
We don't know what things will look like in 20 years' time.
Good.
Hello. I'm a forensic paper conservator, and I'm often asked to come in and do disaster planning within institutions. One of the institutions I worked with a couple of years ago had the original Shakespearean manuscript. And an organization came in and evaluated it at £40 million. They don't have that kind of money to insure this. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on this. So what we looked at is the value of restoration. If the institution goes on fire, or if they lose the manuscript, it's gone. But if we can restore it at X amount of money, we can pay for that insurance, for that institution. What do you think about that approach?
I would say it's a personal one in the end. Insurance is a complex. I know collectors who have hugely valuable collections, tens of millions, and they don't invest. They don't insure anything because artworks are unique and on the whole priceless. Particularly if they're it's hard to define their value artistically or historically. And some people just take the view, well, actually, I'm not going to insure things. It's a drain of money, a bit of a hole. Perhaps that's an extreme view. on the other hand, ensuring everything to its maximum is going to be a huge burden.
But have you thought about the insurance for the restoration?
I haven't heard of that before, but I think I can understand why someone might take that view. It's sort of hedging, sitting on the fence a bit and hedging one's bet. But yes, if the full value insurance is just unachievable, I guess that's a conversation to have with one's insurance broker, perhaps one's lawyer. But I do think insurance, people take many different views on it, and there is no right or wrong, particularly if it's work you produce yourself, or in this case, the museum work. I suppose one might try to apply for a government indemnity or another form of a way of guaranteeing the insurance of the work. But if it's an artist estate, I can't think many artist estates are fully insured.
I'm afraid to say no. So with the works with the dealers, they're insured. It's their problems.
Send it to your
if they're in a museum, if they're on loan, and they're insured, or if they're travelling, they're insured. No, you can't possibly, one can't possibly afford. You can't afford it.
That's right. I spent a bit of time placing pieces with government indemnity scheme cover for exactly that reason.
Exactly.
Thank you. I think we've got probably time for a quick one. Yes.
Whether it's me. I'm not sure whether I really should be asking this question, but I was just wondering if, as an artist that isn't particularly well known, obviously, you have to have some benefit from the trustee or however you do it. How do you then assess whether an artist's work perhaps will give you a return, to be crude about it? So do you make an arrangement with the trustees or the family, or right from the start, do you come to an arrangement as to how this might initially start in taking on a particular artist's work that may not be so well known?
Well, I just to clarify, when we're talking, and I'm not sure, I may have misunderstood you, but where we've been talking about trusts thus far, it's been a will trust, and so that means that the trust that you have of your work, or indeed all your assets when you die, only comes to life at the point when you die. So, and that's important because during one's lifetime, an artist needs to be able to benefit, live with the works, enjoy an income stream. And that's often what puts artists off having a foundation, even those with a large profile. It's very restrictive to have a trust that exists over there with a separate body of trustees, and you're not allowed to benefit from it if it's a charity. So that creates difficulties, and I have advised a couple of clients not to do it now, unlike Henry Moore, who successfully did it well before he died. So I think in that instance, the trust exists at the point of death. And then maybe, if I was sort of answering your question, the will trust is then there for as long as you need it. And that's the discussion I have with clients, because you won't know until that moment what is in the estate, what the artist's profile looks like, how much money the family need. And it's only when you've been through that exercise that you can see how you can create something that might be the lasting legacy. Now, in some cases, that will just be having a trust for the surviving wife and children in the normal way, just like my will for my husband and children. And that runs for as long as possible, and they become the artists and manage it with input from professionals for a while. But then in other cases, we've been able to separate it out and say, well, that house over there, the investment's in cash, that heads off to the family. When we look at the studio and the artwork, and perhaps an endowment fund, some investments to keep it going with some trustees who know what they're doing over here, can then become this separate, freestanding, either the will trust of Mr. X or a foundation if there's sufficient public benefit. You're going to make student grants, you're going to open it to the public, it will do good. So it all depends on scale and value, as you say. It's got to be flexible, and that's why artists should
The key point there is flexibility, exactly. So you can
read the
review
reviews.
it
Yeah.
at the time of death, and if there is not a market for the work, then the works can go to family members or gift to friends and sort of fold the estate at that time. So, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's probably a good point to close, because I think our time is up. Thank you so much to all our panellists for coming today and all of you and for your questions. And feel free to take some information on there about us. Thank you so much. Goodbye.